At 4:47 a.m. Eastern Time on March 2nd, 2025, something unprecedented happened in the history of global supply chains. Inside Tokyo's Trade Ministry building, officials triggered a restriction on semiconductor and advanced technology exports to the United States that hasn't been seen since Japan's strategic alliance with America solidified in 1952. The consequence, $940 billion in annual supply capacity, has been weaponized against Silicon Valley, and nobody outside a handful of federal agencies saw it coming. What you're about to learn will fundamentally reshape your understanding of American economic vulnerability, and frankly, it should terrify you. If you care about what happens to your retirement accounts, your grandchildren's economic future, or whether the United States can maintain technological superiority against China, please hit that subscribe button right now. What we're covering today requires urgent attention, and we're uploading breaking developments as this situation escalates. According to three sources familiar with the negotiations, one inside the State Department, one connected to a Silicon Valley CEO, and one within Japan's foreign ministry, this isn't a spontaneous decision. This represents 6 months of behind-the-scenes economic warfare that Americans have been completely unaware of. We've obtained documentation showing when this began, who authorized it, and most importantly, the devastating timeline facing American technology companies if this restriction remains in place beyond April 15th. Let's establish the baseline. The United States currently depends on Japanese supply chains for 73% of the advanced semiconductor materials used in artificial intelligence processors, 91% of the rare earth element refining capacity for defense applications, and 58% of the critical components in quantum computing infrastructure. These aren't luxury items. These are the literal foundation upon which American technological dominance rests. When Japan turned that spigot off at 4:47 this morning, they didn't just restrict trade, they fundamentally altered the balance of technological power in ways that will ripple through every aspect of American economic and military capability. The backstory begins in November 2024. According to multiple people briefed on diplomatic correspondence, the Japanese government approached the Biden administration with a proposal regarding semiconductor manufacturing. Japan was essentially offering to build advanced fabrication plants on American soil, bringing cutting-edge production capacity directly here. The proposal included specific financial commitments, technological transfer agreements, and workforce development initiatives. The estimated investment, $320 billion over 8 years. But here's where it gets complicated. The incoming Trump administration signaled that such agreements needed to be renegotiated. They wanted different terms. They wanted technology transfer provisions expanded. They wanted ownership structures modified. According to documentation reviewed by our sources, Trump's team made demands that Japanese leadership viewed as fundamentally destabilizing to the agreement's economic viability. On February 18th at 2:33 p.m. Tokyo time, Japan's Prime Minister instructed Trade Ministry officials to prepare contingency protocols. Those protocols became active 2 weeks later. This represents a psychological breaking point. The Japanese government essentially concluded that negotiating with the incoming administration was creating more risk than the actual restriction itself. That decision-making process involved multiple layers of authorization, pressure from private sector technology companies, and input from their defense ministry. The person who made the final call was Trade Minister Hiroshi Yamamoto, a 63-year-old career diplomat who has guided Japan's economic policy through 3 prime ministers. According to one source, he explicitly stated that America was taking Japan for granted and that we will demonstrate that no nation, regardless of size, can treat our strategic interests as negotiable commodities. Now let's address what this actually means in practical terms. Within 48 hours of the restriction announcement, stock markets globally experienced what we're calling a tech shock. The S&P 500's technology sector dropped 2%. Semiconductor manufacturers saw individual shares drop 12 to 23%, depending on their Japanese supply chain dependency. Nvidia, which relies on Japanese materials for their most advanced chip architectures, experienced a 16% decline in 48 hours. But here's what's terrifying about this moment. Unlike traditional trade disputes, you cannot simply redirect semiconductor supply chains overnight. These supply chains require years to establish. The specialized equipment comes from Japan. The rare earth materials come from Japan. The quality control certifications come from Japan. There is no plan B. There is no quick workaround. There's only a clock counting down toward economic catastrophe. Let me provide you with the specific timeline because this is where urgency becomes genuinely justified. As of today, March 3rd, American semiconductor manufacturers have approximately 60 days of Japanese materials in inventory. That takes us to May 3rd. If this restriction remains in place beyond May 3rd, American semiconductor production capacity begins experiencing cascading shutdowns. First, its advanced AI chip production. That affects OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, Amazon. That affects military applications. Within 90 days, it affects consumer electronics, automobiles, medical devices, and power grid infrastructure. Within 120 days, approximately June 30th, American technological capacity begins experiencing systemic breakdown. We're talking about the infrastructure that literally runs the modern economy. The government can invoke emergency protocols, but those protocols rely on either Japan changing course or alternative suppliers coming online. Neither is remotely possible on these timelines. Here's where the character dynamics become fascinating and terrifying. On the American side, we have Silicon Valley CEOs who are now experiencing a level of panic that hasn't been visible since the early COVID lockdown period. According to one source, a major tech CEO has been in near constant contact with federal officials, attempting to pressure Japan into reversing course. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is attempting a negotiating strategy that involves both threats and inducements, neither of which appears to be moving the needle with Japanese leadership. The Japanese side presents a different psychology. Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru is a 72-year-old political veteran who has spent his career positioning Japan as an equal to America rather than a subordinate. According to someone who has briefed with him, he views this restriction as leverage to force the renegotiation of semiconductor agreements on terms that actually benefit Japan. He's not trying to destroy American technology. He's trying to prove that Japan cannot be taken for granted. That's the psychological tension underneath this crisis. This isn't malice. This is economic leverage deployed as a communication mechanism. The question is whether Trump's administration can recognize that distinction and adjust accordingly, or whether American hubris will drive this toward actual economic warfare that benefits China. Speaking of China, if you haven't yet hit that like button, please do now. What we're about to discuss requires you signaling to the algorithm that this information matters. The situation gets exponentially more dangerous when we introduce the China variable. According to 3 sources familiar with Chinese strategic assessment, Beijing is monitoring this situation with intense interest. If the United States loses technological advantage due to Japanese restrictions, China's own supply chain position becomes exponentially more valuable. This creates incentive for China to actually encourage Japan to maintain the restriction while simultaneously making moves to position Chinese manufacturers as alternatives for critical technologies. Let me lay out the 4 scenarios that are now being actively modeled by government officials. Scenario 1. Japan and the United States reach a negotiated settlement within 30 days. Trade Minister Yamamoto achieves minor concessions from the Trump administration on supply chain agreements. Japan reverses the restriction, and we return to baseline economic conditions. I assign this scenario a 35% probability. It requires both sides recognizing that economic damage exceeds any negotiating benefit. Scenario 2. Japan maintains the restriction while negotiations continue, creating a grinding economic pressure campaign that lasts 3 to 5 months. During this period, American supply chains degrade incrementally, semiconductor companies lose months of production, and eventually, the Trump administration capitulates on previously non-negotiable terms. This creates precedent that economic coercion works and invites similar action from other nations holding technological leverage. I assign this scenario 40% probability because it reflects Japan's demonstrated willingness to endure short-term economic pain for strategic objectives. Scenario 3. American military or intelligence agencies take direct action. According to sources, there are discussions about potential cybersecurity measures targeting Japanese supply chain tracking systems, potential intelligence operations designed to pressure Japanese officials, or even potential economic countermeasures that escalate this into genuine trade war territory. If this path activates, we're looking at potential disruption of Japanese export networks broadly, affecting automobiles, consumer electronics, pharmaceuticals. This creates a scenario where both nations experience severe economic damage. I assign this 15% probability, though it increases significantly if the supply shortage reaches crisis levels. Scenario 4. This situation becomes leverage point in broader geopolitical realignment. Japan, facing Chinese pressure, realizes that economic warfare with America serves nobody's interests and begins negotiations toward a completely restructured technology alliance involving security guarantees, manufacturing partnerships, and potentially even formal collective defense enhancement. This represents the optimistic outcome where crisis becomes catalyst for stronger partnership. I assign this 10% probability because it requires both sides viewing this as opportunity rather than threat. Here's what matters in the next 72 hours. Trade negotiations continue in Geneva on March 5th. At that point, either movement toward Japanese concessions becomes visible or we enter the grinding scenario 2 dynamic. Watch for statements from American officials signaling flexibility on manufacturing agreements or technology transfer provisions. Watch for Japanese statements emphasizing Japan's willingness to move forward. The language matters because it signals trajectory. Within 14 days, we'll know if the supply situation is stabilizing. Semiconductor manufacturers will report progress toward accessing alternative suppliers or whether Japanese restrictions are becoming genuinely catastrophic. At that point, probability percentages I've assigned will either shift toward resolution or toward deeper crisis. Either way, you need to be paying attention to how this develops because it affects your retirement accounts, inflation rates, interest rates, and economic stability. This moment represents something profound about American power and vulnerability that we need to be honest about. The United States became the dominant global power, partly through technological superiority. That superiority depends on supply chains we don't control and haven't secured. Japan is demonstrating that America can be pressured in ways most Americans haven't considered. This is the moment where geopolitical reality crashes through the illusion of American invulnerability. If you haven't already, please like this video and drop your prediction in the comments. Do you think the Trump administration will negotiate favorable terms with Japan, or are we looking at extended economic conflict? Your thoughts matter because they help the algorithm understand that this content is driving genuine engagement, which means we can continue providing you with deep dives into the crises you need to understand. Most importantly, subscribe and enable notifications because developments will emerge daily. When Japanese officials make statements about negotiation progress, we'll break it down immediately. When American semiconductor manufacturers report supply disruptions, we'll analyze the implications. When government agencies announce emergency protocols, you'll understand what they actually mean for your financial future. The next weeks and months will determine whether America maintains technological dominance or whether we've entered the era of Japanese economic leverage over American strategic interests. That's the story, that's what's happening, and that's what you need to understand right now, today, in this moment.